It started with a notice taped to my front door, bold red letters screaming, "Violation." They said I was using too much water, draining the neighborhood supply, and if I didn't correct the issue, I'd face daily fines. The problem, my sprinklers hadn't even run in months. I remember standing there staring at that paper, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. They were accusing me of something I knew wasn't true. But as I looked deeper into their threats, one detail made me smile, a detail they had no idea about. Because the water they were trying to fine me for using was coming straight from my company. So what happens when the HOA tries to punish the person who controls their water? For years, life in the community felt peaceful, almost predictable. The kind of place where lawns looked identical, mailboxes lined up perfectly, and everyone waved the same polite smile as they drove by. The homeowner, a quiet and practical man named Daniel, liked it that way. He had bought the house as a retreat from chaos, a place to slow down, build something lasting, and maybe enjoy the calm of a suburban dream that everyone else seemed to chase. Daniel wasn't the kind of person to stir trouble. He paid his dues, followed the rules, and kept to himself. His backyard overlooked the small man-made pond that supplied water for the entire neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it gave him a sense of peace, watching the sunrise ripple across the water each morning before work. The community's HOA was notorious for being strict, but Daniel never paid much attention. He'd heard stories, a neighbor fined for a mailbox that didn't match the approved color, another forced to remove a tree that interfered with sight lines. It was frustrating, sure, but Daniel figured it was easier to stay out of their way. He just wanted to live quietly, keep his property clean, and mind his own business. But things began to change when the drought hit. Water restrictions were imposed citywide, and lawns across the neighborhood turned brown almost overnight. The HOA panicked, sending out new regulations, enforcement letters, and reminders about responsible water usage. They started checking meters, tracking sprinklers, and posting fines faster than residents could respond. Daniel didn't think much of it at first. His property's irrigation came from a private well system, one that wasn't connected to the city supply. It was completely legal, a small perk from an old business deal he'd once made, back when he invested in local water infrastructure. It was one of those quiet details no one in the neighborhood really knew about, and Daniel never thought it would matter, until the first warning showed up. A notice appeared in his mailbox claiming his excessive water usage violated HOA policy. The message was cold, impersonal, and filled with vague threats about penalties and enforcement action. At first, Daniel assumed it was a clerical error. He decided to ignore it. After all, mistakes happen. But the second notice arrived a week later, then a third. And this time, the fines were attached, each letter more aggressive than the last, each one demanding immediate payment. Daniel started to feel that familiar twist of unease, that creeping sense that someone was watching, tracking, building a case against him. Neighbors started whispering, too. Some mentioned seeing HOA inspectors pacing near his property line, jotting notes, taking photos of his yard. The air in the neighborhood began to feel different, tighter, colder, as if every small infraction was being monitored. Daniel realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something bigger, a power struggle dressed up as community policy. He didn't know it yet, but the HOA's obsession with his water usage would soon expose a secret they never expected and flip their entire sense of control upside down.
The fines didn't stop. They multiplied. Each week, another envelope arrived, each one thicker than the last, stacked with notices, threats, and official documentation. The HOA wasn't backing off. They were escalating. And the more Daniel tried to reason with them, the clearer it became that logic had no place in their crusade. By the third week, he was accused of wasting more water than 3 neighboring homes combined. According to their report, his irrigation system was operating outside of permitted hours, even though Daniel didn't have one connected to the city system at all. They claimed to have photographic evidence, blurry night shots of sprinklers running, water pooling near his fence line, except Daniel knew exactly what those photos showed: his neighbor's sprinklers, spraying from the other side of the property line. He called the HOA office. The woman who answered sounded polite, but detached, like someone reading from a script. "Sir, if you wish to appeal the fines, you may do so in writing. However, during the appeal, penalties will continue to accumulate. That was the rule, their favorite rule. You could fight, sure, but every day you delayed meant more fees, more late charges, more pressure." Daniel sent them everything: proof of his private well, water records, documentation from the city confirming he wasn't even on municipal supply. None of it mattered. The HOA's board met privately and voted to uphold the fines pending further investigation. It was clear they didn't care about facts. They cared about control. Soon, things turned personal. HOA board members began stopping by Daniel's property for inspections. They claimed it was part of their investigation, but showed up unannounced, walking along his driveway, taking photos without permission. One even leaned over his backyard fence to check the irrigation source. It felt invasive, almost predatory. At night, Daniel could see flashlight beams flickering near his yard. He started finding small flags in his grass, markers left behind after water usage inspections. It was harassment, dressed up as procedure. He reported it to the HOA president, who brushed it off, claiming, "Our volunteers are just doing their jobs." The neighbors started whispering. Rumors spread that Daniel was hoarding water, illegally pumping from restricted wells, endangering community resources. People began avoiding him, conversations cutting short when he walked by. What used to be a peaceful home now felt like a cage surrounded by suspicion. And yet, Daniel didn't lash out. He waited. He watched. Because while the HOA thought they were cornering him, he knew something they didn't. The water they were obsessing over wasn't the city's at all. It came from his own network, a private infrastructure he partially owned through an investment years earlier, the same system that quietly supplied this very community. But Daniel wasn't ready to play that card just yet. He wanted them to show their hand first. The next HOA meeting came with even more theatrics. The board sat in their usual row, smug, self-assured, wielding clipboards like weapons. Daniel was given a brief window to present his defense. He explained again, calmly, that his water source was private, completely separate from the municipal grid. He provided printed proof, water records, legal records, even correspondence from the Utility Commission verifying ownership. None of them mattered. The HOA's board met privately and voted to uphold the fines pending further investigation. It was clear they didn't care about facts. They cared about control. Then, the board chair cleared his throat. "Our concern isn't ownership, Mr. Daniels. It's community equity. Your lawn appears greener than most. That reflects poorly on our compliance standards." Too green. That was his crime now. Not water theft, not rule breaking, just being too compliant for their comfort. They voted again, unanimously, to maintain the fines. And this time they added a clause: failure to pay would result in a lien against his property. That was the moment something shifted. The irritation that had simmered quietly turned into resolve. If they wanted to test authority, he would show them who truly held it. The following week, Daniel noticed something strange. The community water pressure dropped dramatically. Residents started complaining in the HOA's online forum. "Why is there barely any water flow? Is something wrong with the supply? My sprinklers aren't working." The HOA scrambled. They called the water company, demanding immediate attention. But the report they received only deepened the chaos. Maintenance delays due to pending authorization from ownership. Ownership. That word sent confusion rippling through the board.
because when they asked who owned the maintenance rights for their supply system, the answer came back under one name: Daniel Harper. Behind the scenes, Daniel had quietly instructed his company's regional manager to place a temporary hold on the HOA supply for administrative review. It was standard protocol, completely within policy, but it effectively meant the entire community's irrigation systems were down. The HOA panicked. Emails flooded in. Emergency meetings were called. They didn't yet understand the full scope of it, but they were starting to. The man they had been fining for excessive water use was in fact a partial owner of the company that supplied their water infrastructure. Daniel stayed silent for 2 days. He didn't respond to their frantic messages. He wanted them to stew, to feel, for once, the weight of their own bureaucracy pressing down. Then, on the 3rd day, he replied with a single, measured email. Before we discuss supply restoration, I'd like to ensure all previous fines have been withdrawn and my property records corrected. No threats, no anger, just calm, controlled authority. The board met again in panic mode. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to comply immediately. They realized if they pushed too hard, they risked alienating the very system their entire water distribution relied on. They called Daniel, asking for a friendly resolution. Daniel agreed to meet, but only at his office downtown, not at the HOA Center, the same building that bore the name of his company on its glass doors. As the HOA representatives walked through the lobby, their confidence started to crumble. They passed photos of infrastructure projects, company achievements, and community partners, including their own subdivision. And at the top of the shareholder list framed in the hallway, there it was again: Daniel Harper, co-owner. He didn't need to gloat. The truth did it for him. The HOA had overstepped for weeks, trespassing, threatening, humiliating, all under the assumption that they held power. Now, that illusion shattered. They were standing inside the very system they'd tried to weaponize against him. Daniel calmly explained how their violations, inspections, and slander could constitute harassment and property interference. He offered them a choice: retract every fine, issue a public apology, and restore his reputation within the community, or face formal legal action and a public exposure of their misconduct. The board didn't need long to decide. Within 48 hours, all fines were rescinded, official apologies were mailed to residents, and Daniel's record was cleared. But even then, the tension didn't dissolve. Because when people who crave power are humiliated, they don't forget easily. The HOA's pride was wounded, and Daniel knew they might try to retaliate quietly. But this time, he was ready. He wasn't the quiet homeowner they could push around anymore. He was the one holding the valve that made their entire operation run. And as the next board election loomed, whispers began circulating. Rumors that Daniel might run for a seat, not out of revenge, but to finally bring balance to the chaos. Whether he would or not, well, that's what no one knew yet. But one thing was clear: the days of unchecked control in that neighborhood were over. Because when the HOA tried to drown Daniel in paperwork, they never realized he owned the well they were standing over. And now the flow of power had changed direction entirely.
The air in the neighborhood felt different that week. Tense, uncertain, like everyone was waiting for something to break. Whispers had started to spread faster than the HOA could control them. People who once ignored Daniel now slowed their cars when they passed his house. Some offered cautious waves, others turned away quickly, as if unsure whose side they were supposed to be on. The board members kept their distance, but their silence said more than words ever could. They were nervous. Daniel knew why. The HOA had spent weeks trying to bury their mistake, first with denial, then with excuses, and finally with quiet panic. But the truth had already seeped through the cracks. Homeowners were beginning to ask questions about the water restrictions, the unexplained outages, and why the fines had suddenly disappeared. The board's credibility was crumbling, and Daniel hadn't even made his final move yet. Then came the meeting. The HOA had called an emergency community forum to clarify misunderstandings about the recent water disruptions. Every homeowner was invited. For most, it was the first time in years they'd attended one of these meetings, and this time they weren't there to nod along. They wanted answers. The community hall filled fast. Folding chairs scraped against the tile as residents packed in, murmuring in low, uneasy tones. The board sat at the front, 5 members in matching navy blazers, faces stiff and pale under the fluorescent lights. In the center sat Greg Thompson, the board president, a man who loved rules almost as much as he loved being the one who enforced them. He cleared his throat into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. We've been made aware of rumors circulating regarding the recent water issues in our community. We want to assure you that everything is under control." It wasn't. A hand went up in the crowd, then another. The questions started coming faster than Greg could answer. Why did the water company pause service? Why were residents fined without evidence? Why did Daniel receive letters threatening liens? Greg stumbled through his responses, dodging, redirecting, repeating phrases like pending review and miscommunication. But the crowd wasn't buying it. The tone in the room was shifting from confusion to anger. Then Daniel stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The moment he spoke, the entire room went silent. "Greg," he said evenly, "since we're discussing water supply and accountability, maybe it's time the homeowners here knew who they've actually been paying for the last decade." Greg froze. "This isn't the time." "No, it's exactly the time," he interrupted. He stepped forward, a folder in hand. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel placed the folder on the table in front of them and slid it across. "That," he said, "is documentation from the State Water Commission confirming partial ownership of the supply infrastructure serving this subdivision. It lists shareholders, maintenance agreements, and," he paused for effect, "primary licensing authority." He looked directly at Greg. "My name is on the first page." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Greg's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Daniel continued, his tone steady, but edged with controlled fury. "For weeks, this board accused me of violating water restrictions. You fined me thousands of dollars for usage I don't even report to your system. You trespassed on my property, harassed me, and spread lies to my neighbors, all while drawing water from a network I own a controlling share in." The room exploded in murmurs. Someone in the back laughed in disbelief. Another shouted, "Is that true?" Greg stammered, We were following protocol." "Protocol?" Daniel's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You built your whole case on arrogance. You didn't check facts. You didn't ask questions. You just assumed authority and used it like a weapon. But here's the thing about power, Greg. It doesn't mean much when you've been drinking from someone else's well." The tension in the room cracked. Several homeowners clapped, hesitant at first, then louder, bolder. The sound filled the hall like thunder. Greg tried to regain control, pounding his gavel on the table. "This meeting is adjourned!" he shouted, his voice breaking. But Daniel wasn't done. "Not yet," he said, pulling out a second document, this one printed on legal letterhead. "Since the HOA refused to retract the false fines or acknowledge my ownership, my attorney has filed for an injunction against further enforcement actions. Effective immediately, the HOA is barred from issuing new penalties related to water usage until the court hearing next month." Gasps again, sharper this time. The board's faces drained of color. They'd gone from untouchable enforcers to defendants in a matter of seconds. "And," Daniel added, almost as an afterthought, "I've also instructed my company to audit all accounts associated with this subdivision.
Any outstanding balances will need verification before service continues. The implication was clear. They had humiliated the wrong person, and now the balance of control had shifted entirely. The meeting ended in chaos. Board members whispered frantically to one another. Residents clustered around Daniel, thanking him, asking questions, venting frustrations. Years of quiet resentment against the HOA were bubbling up all at once.
When Daniel finally stepped outside, the night air felt different, cooler, lighter. The neighborhood that once felt suffocating now seemed open, like a weight had been lifted. But beneath that relief was something else, a spark of defiance that hadn't been there before. The next morning, the fallout began. Emails from the HOA flooded inboxes, apologies, clarifications, desperate attempts to restore community trust. But it was too late. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. The story reached nearby neighborhoods, even local news outlets who'd been covering water shortages in the area. Within a week, a short article appeared online. Homeowner exposes HOA mismanagement over water fines. Turns out he owns the supply company. It went viral in local circles. Neighbors from other communities reached out with their own stories of abuse, fines, and overreach. Daniel became something of a symbol, the quiet resident who finally stood up to the system and won. But behind that victory was exhaustion. The months of harassment had taken their toll. His home, once a place of peace, had become a battlefield. And though he'd come out on top, Daniel couldn't shake the question lingering in his mind. How many others had been bullied into silence before him? That thought kept him up the next few nights. Not anger now, purpose. So he did something no one expected. He drafted a proposal to dissolve the current HOA board entirely. Legally, it was possible if enough homeowners voted for it. He gathered evidence, documentation, and signatures. Within weeks, he had more than half the neighborhood backing him. When the next vote came, the board was removed in a landslide. Greg resigned publicly, red-faced and humiliated, muttering about personal reasons. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His revenge wasn't in making them suffer, it was in restoring balance to the place he'd once called home. Standing at the edge of the pond one evening, watching the sunset reflect off the calm water, Daniel realized the irony. The HOA had built their power on control, on the illusion that they owned what everyone depended on. But control built on ignorance is fragile. One truth, one document, one person willing to push back, that's all it takes to crack the foundation. And as the wind rippled across the surface of the water, Daniel smiled quietly to himself. Because while the HOA had spent months trying to drain him dry, they'd forgotten the one simple fact that had doomed them from the start. You can't find the man who owns the water. And that was the moment everything changed.
The weeks following the HOA's downfall brought a shift that felt almost surreal. The once anxious, intense atmosphere in the neighborhood slowly dissolved into something lighter, hopeful even. People who used to avoid eye contact now lifted their hands in friendly waves. Neighbors whose lawns once browned under strict restrictions now felt free to water responsibly, without fear of slipping notices or fines. The whole community seemed to exhale a long-held breath. Daniel witnessed it all from his porch, a quiet satisfaction growing inside him. Not the kind born from vengeance, but from justice. Something deeply wrong had finally been made right. But despite the victory, Daniel didn't retreat into solitude. He recognized a truth he had ignored for too long. The HOA's abuse of power thrived because residents were too scared or too disconnected to fight back. Left unchecked, that vacuum of accountability would inevitably invite corruption again. So Daniel stepped up. He accepted the nominations and became the new president of the restructured HOA board, not because he craved authority, but because someone responsible needed to protect the rights of everyone living there. And from the very first meeting, the difference was obvious. No more threats, no more secret fines, no more spying on yards at night under the guise of inspection. Instead, he introduced transparency, clear rules, open finances, and homeowner-first decision-making. Every meeting was broadcast live for anyone to watch from home. Documents were posted publicly, not hidden behind red tape. The community responded with overwhelming relief. Attendance at meetings skyrocketed, not out of fear, but curiosity and involvement. People finally felt represented, not policed. One of Daniel's first actions was reviewing every fine issued over the past 2 years. The results were staggering. Thousands of dollars wrongfully taken from frightened residents, much of it from retirees and single parents. Under Daniel's direction, the HOA voted to return every cent with interest. The day the refund checks arrived, families celebrated openly in driveways. You could hear laughter echoing down the streets that once felt suffocating. A burden had been lifted, not just financial, but emotional. Still, consequences remained for those who caused the damage. The former board members faced their own reckoning. Greg, the previous president, was investigated by the state HOA Oversight Committee. It turned out that the harassment against Daniel was not an isolated mistake. Several homeowners had filed complaints in recent years, all dismissed internally by Greg himself. Without the power he once wielded, Greg's smug confidence crumbled. The man who believed rules were his weapon now found himself answering questions he could no longer dodge. Eventually, he was barred from serving on any HOA board again. His name became a cautionary tale whispered in local legal circles. Meanwhile, Daniel quietly renewed his investment in the water infrastructure. What had once been just another business asset now held profound personal meaning. He ensured that a portion of revenue from this neighborhood would be reinvested into community improvements, new shade trees, upgraded playground equipment, and a community garden near the pond. The same pond that once symbolized division now sparked connection. Residents picnicked along its banks. Kids who used to stay inside to avoid enforcement patrols now played freely in their backyards. People walked dogs without fear of being told their leash length was non-compliant. Life finally resembled what it should have always been. But for Daniel, the greatest impact was more internal than external. His home, once a place where HOA letters brought dread, became a sanctuary again. The silence in his yard felt peaceful instead of tense. When he looked at the mailbox now, he didn't brace himself, he simply opened it. He often found small notes from neighbors thanking him, handwritten messages acknowledging courage they admitted they didn't have. One homeowner brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies. Another offered to mow his lawn while he was out of town. The same people who once watched him suspiciously now saw him as someone who stood up for them, not just himself. Daniel realized something powerful. Sometimes one person's refusal to be bullied gives everyone else permission to stand taller. It wasn't that he'd suddenly become a hero. It was that he had reminded the community they deserved respect.
Months later, during a mild summer evening, the neighborhood gathered at the park to celebrate the end of restrictions and the return of peaceful living. Lanterns glowed from tree branches, kids ran around laughing, someone set up a grill, and music floated through the warm air. Daniel stood by the pond, watching the reflection of lights shimmer across the surface. He thought back to the very beginning, the first letter taped to his door, the false accusations, the late-night invasions of privacy, the public humiliation attempts. All because a system built to help people had forgotten its purpose. As he looked around now at the families enjoying a night without fear, he felt something close to pride. Not in overthrowing the HOA, but in restoring what the neighborhood was meant to be. Later that evening, a resident approached him, a widowed woman named Ellen, who had lived there longer than anyone else. She told Daniel something that stuck with him. Rules don't make community. People do. That sentence echoed inside him long after the gathering ended, because it was true. Rules can guide, rules can shape, but when rules become weapons, a community becomes a prison. Daniel's fight had made sure the gates of that prison were thrown wide open. And every time he saw a new resident moving in, smiling, hopeful, unaware of the chaos that once unfolded here,
He felt grateful. They would never know the ugliness that almost took over this place. And that was the point. One day, as he closed his office after another smooth, peaceful HOA meeting, he paused by the framed article hanging on the wall, a reminder of how far they had come. Homeowner shuts down HOA abuse by turning off their water. He smiled, turning off the light, because if this story proved anything, it was this. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. Power doesn't belong to the rule wielder. Power belongs to the people who refuse to be pushed down, no matter how strong the push becomes. And for anyone living under the weight of unfair systems or petty authority, Daniel hoped his story would serve as a spark, a reminder that standing up isn't reckless, it's necessary. After all, how long can those in power stay standing when the very ground beneath them starts to shift? Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say, "No more."
It started with a notice taped to my front door, bold red letters screaming, "Violation." They said I was using too much water, draining the neighborhood supply, and if I didn't correct the issue, I'd face daily fines. The problem, my sprinklers hadn't even run in months. I remember standing there staring at that paper, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. They were accusing me of something I knew wasn't true. But as I looked deeper into their threats, one detail made me smile, a detail they had no idea about. Because the water they were trying to fine me for using was coming straight from my company. So what happens when the HOA tries to punish the person who controls their water? For years, life in the community felt peaceful, almost predictable. The kind of place where lawns looked identical, mailboxes lined up perfectly, and everyone waved the same polite smile as they drove by. The homeowner, a quiet and practical man named Daniel, liked it that way. He had bought the house as a retreat from chaos, a place to slow down, build something lasting, and maybe enjoy the calm of a suburban dream that everyone else seemed to chase. Daniel wasn't the kind of person to stir trouble. He paid his dues, followed the rules, and kept to himself. His backyard overlooked the small man-made pond that supplied water for the entire neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it gave him a sense of peace, watching the sunrise ripple across the water each morning before work. The community's HOA was notorious for being strict, but Daniel never paid much attention. He'd heard stories, a neighbor fined for a mailbox that didn't match the approved color, another forced to remove a tree that interfered with sight lines. It was frustrating, sure, but Daniel figured it was easier to stay out of their way. He just wanted to live quietly, keep his property clean, and mind his own business. But things began to change when the drought hit. Water restrictions were imposed citywide, and lawns across the neighborhood turned brown almost overnight. The HOA panicked, sending out new regulations, enforcement letters, and reminders about responsible water usage. They started checking meters, tracking sprinklers, and posting fines faster than residents could respond. Daniel didn't think much of it at first. His property's irrigation came from a private well system, one that wasn't connected to the city supply. It was completely legal, a small perk from an old business deal he'd once made, back when he invested in local water infrastructure. It was one of those quiet details no one in the neighborhood really knew about, and Daniel never thought it would matter, until the first warning showed up. A notice appeared in his mailbox claiming his excessive water usage violated HOA policy. The message was cold, impersonal, and filled with vague threats about penalties and enforcement action. At first, Daniel assumed it was a clerical error. He decided to ignore it. After all, mistakes happen. But the second notice arrived a week later, then a third. And this time, the fines were attached, each letter more aggressive than the last. each one demanding immediate payment. Daniel started to feel that familiar twist of unease, that creeping sense that someone was watching, tracking, building a case against him. Neighbors started whispering too. Some mentioned seeing HOA inspectors pacing near his property line, jotting notes, taking photos of his yard. The air in the neighborhood began to feel different, tighter, colder, as if every small infraction was being monitored. Daniel realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something bigger, a power struggle dressed up as community policy. He didn't know it yet, but the HOA's obsession with his water usage would soon expose a secret they never expected and flip their entire sense of control upside down.